I reached out to Dr. Kira Hudson Banks because I wanted to have someone help me with feeling comfortable and feeling confident in talking to my girls about race and racism and getting them to have an equity mindset because she is all about raising equity. Well, the conversation was about that and so much more. This is a very eye-opening episode of Two Kids and a Career. Blondin Professional Real Estate is a family-owned, boutique-style brokerage with over 40 years' experience serving the counties that surround St. Louis. See how their approach to real estate will help you by visiting blondinrealestate.com. What happens when you put a career-focused woman with 2 kids trying to balance home and work life in a room with a microphone? Lots of laughter, tears, and great advice. I'm Jill Devine, and welcome to Two Kids and a Career. Typically, I have an intro completely prepared and rehearsed in my head before I jump into these episodes. And this particular intro, I've gone over it a million times in my head, and I don't have anything. I am nervous. I'm at a loss for words. So I'm stealing something that I saw on Twitter earlier today from Chanel Jones of the third hour of the Today Show. And she said this about active listening. Quote, when you just close your mouth and listen, you hear more than even what people are saying, but how they're saying it. So that's what I'm going to do. I'll ask questions when I feel like it's appropriate, but my guest, Dr. Kira Hudson Banks, I'm going to shut my mouth and let you talk. First of all, thank you so much for coming on this podcast. It's an honor, and I know that you are tremendously busy, so thank you.
Well, thanks for having me and using your platform for the conversation.
So you have a lot of different titles, and I don't know exactly which one we want to start with. I know that I reached out to you because I said I wanted to have some information on how you talk to kids about what is happening right now in our world with the murder of George Floyd and racism and all of this stuff that I am not educated on. I thought I was. That's ignorant to say. So I am going to shut my mouth and let you talk.
Well, I honestly think it's important. This is a time for us to talk. That I've heard a lot of white people say, I'm just going to listen. And while I appreciate people wanting to listen, I also want people to understand that if we understand how systems of oppression work, we need everyone at the table, especially those who are systematically advantaged by the system. So let me give a few examples. In my consulting work, I use the mouse and elephant example. So, the elephant is not a aggressive creature necessarily. It's just big and it takes up a lot of space, and it can move around and unknowingly maybe trample the mouse. Well, so the mouse has to be extremely aware of its surroundings, where the elephant is, and it probably has to read what every twitch of the ear or switch of the tail means about the elephant. And so if the elephant just says, well, mouse, I see you, just let me listen, I hear you, that's one thing. But if the elephant also thinks about, oh, wait, I see the struggle of the mouse. How can I make sure that when I invite him to the table, that it's not an elephant-sized table, or that things are set up so that they can access the table? So it's like one way to think about it is that in dominant and non-dominant groups, dominant groups are like the elephant. The mouse are the non-dominant groups. And it's the responsibility of the elephant to engage in problem solving of like, how can we make this space accessible? The other example I'll give is around gender. So if we think about who gave women the right to vote, it was men. It was men who were in power in Congress. It wasn't easy. There were iron angels. It was voted down before it was voted up. Only white women got the right to vote, but white women got the right to vote, right? So it was men who were in power who gave women the right to vote. So it wouldn't be enough for the men to just say, I hear you, women, let me listen to your plight. No, they actually had to use their power to change things. And so while I get people wanting to, especially white people saying, I want to listen, I of course want you to hear me and believe me, but I more want you to change things.
Okay. So then if the other thing is, maybe there's a question presented to you that you haven't heard from a white person that can help other white people understand and other white people know what to do or what to say?
Well, I think it's a matter of doing your homework, understanding how these systems operate, and then you'll know what to do from your sphere of influence. So, for example, when I came to work at the institution that I currently work at, they didn't give same sex partner benefits. That didn't impact me, but I was committed to being an ally. And so when I heard about that, I looked into it. I said, well, what are we doing about this? This is not fair. This is not right. And I learned that the governing body was working on changing it. So I said, okay, they're already thinking about this policy change. Let me find a way to support that. And they ended up, I think, remedying the problem, that there was this structural inequity. So it's not always about the mouse or the person who's in a systematically disadvantaged or institutionally disadvantaged position saying, this is what I need you to do. Because sometimes, not all the time, I think we've got some solutions here in terms of police brutality that we're not engaging in. But sometimes it's the people in the positions of power that actually know what can be changed, because they have the power and the access in a way that someone who doesn't, sometimes you don't know what you don't know. But I also understand that when you have privilege, sometimes you don't know what you don't know. Like you're like a fish in water. You don't know you're wet. You don't see the ways that you're privileged. For example, I've talked to white people who will say, people say things around me that I don't think they'd say around people of color. Like there are things that you hear and have access to, and opinions that you have access to that I don't as a Black woman. So if you start to pay attention to how racism works as a system and how people operate within it, and do your homework, I think you'll learn and figure out what you can do in your sphere.
Obviously, we don't have all day to talk about racism and the system, but can we talk about some highlights? Because I don't understand.
Well, so I think high level, it's about our country and how we have created opportunities, access, norms, laws, policies around race. And we've created disparate access and disparate opportunity, which yields results that show disparities. So, for example, someone might say, well, Black people just don't want to, they don't care about education. Well, we had Brown v. Board, which was 54, right? There was a fight to not have separate educations, segregated education. Do you know when Missouri as a state finally agreed on a desegregation plan?
No.
Do you want to take a guess? I often do this.
Okay, 1960s?
Later.
1980s?
Yep. So I give that example because racism isn't just about hearts and minds and people being mean to each other. Racism is about systems and laws that keep people apart and keep people with disparate opportunities. So Brown v. Board was 54. We said it's not fair because separate but equal wasn't happening. It was separate, but it sure wasn't equal, right? And so it's essential that we understand the history of how our country has created opportunities around race. And so if in Missouri, Brown v. Board was 54, we didn't figure out and come up with a deseg agreement till the 80s, things weren't equal. And it was racially based. It wasn't until our Supreme Court in our state threatened to create a metropolitan school district. He said, you know what? You all can't figure out how to desegregate. I'll just make a metropolitan school district. Everyone will get bused. Ladue, Kirkwood, Webster, St. Louis City, everyone will get bused. And it wasn't until he threatened that the suburbs said, oh, you know what? We have some seats for them. We'll let some of the Black kids from the city come in. And the reason they couldn't desegregate St. Louis City was because we had so much white flight. So there were only predominantly Black people left in the city. So I don't mean to go into a history lesson, but to say race shapes so much of how our country has operated. And racism, the way in which we systematically advantage white folks and disadvantage people of color, is baked into how we do things. It's baked into how we did citizenship. There was a case, a Japanese American who came forward in, I think it was 1918. Ozawa was the case. And he said, I want to be a U.S. citizen. I'm a business owner. I'm a Christian. I'm as American as they come. I want to be a citizen. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't be because you're not white. Well, they used this bad race science that was basically the basis for Nazi Germany and eugenics. And so it's faulty science, but that's what they were using. That's what our Supreme Court was using. It said that South Asian Indian folks were connected to the Aryan race. So there was the Mongoloid race was connected to the Aryan race. So he said, you know what? I'm gonna apply to be a citizen. So his last name was Thind, so people can look this up. So he came behind and said, you're using this science, and by this science, I should be able to be American. And they said, no, because you're not white. And he said, well, but you said over here it was, and they said, no, white is what the common man knows that it is. So from citizenship to education, we could talk about housing and the birth of the suburbs. There's so many ways in which racism has shaped the lives of people in our country. And so we see what we think is about race, but it's really about racism. So I want to just offer those little stories so that people can go and read more, learn more for yourself. But one of the spheres of influence that we all have is our family. So we can act in our spheres of influence, but one that we all have, even if it's just a chosen family, even if it's our chosen family, is to think about how do we perpetuate those narratives and those norms in our own homes.
A perfect segue to you are a working mom. You have 2 young boys. I don't know their ages.
10 and 13. Yeah.
So I can't even imagine what the conversations you have on the daily are with them. I'm hoping maybe you can walk me through it, but I know that this is what you are here for, raising equity. You want to raise, well, most individuals should want to raise kids with an equity mindset. And I don't know how to do it. And that's one of the main reasons I wanted to talk to you.
Yeah, I'm passionate about it. I think it's the long game because I started to develop this idea of raising equity through my research. So I studied how discrimination impacts mental health for over 20 years now. We know that discrimination impacts mental health, but we also understand that not everyone who's discriminated against is depressed or anxious. So I was very curious as a psychologist, what can we cultivate inside people to help them be strong and resilient in the face of discrimination? But then the flip side of that is, hey, could we create an environment or a world or society where they don't have to deal with discrimination? So my work has always been two-pronged. And so raising equity started out of the work that I was doing. And as a college professor, I've taught now for 16 years, and I've typically taught a class that's some variation of like this, the why we can't talk about race in 2010, 2017, 2020, whatever year it is. I would add the year. Or I've taught a psychology of racism course, which is modeled after the psychology of racism course that I took in college from Beverly Tatum, author of Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, which is a book I recommend to anyone who's interested in this topic. And I would have students come into my psychology of racism or why we can't talk about race class, and they would learn about these laws and norms and policies that I'm referring to. They would learn about how we literally subsidized as a country the birth of the suburbs. So during World War II, GIs came back from World War II and we started to offer ways for people to have access to homes. Like we had the GI Bills, people could go back to school, and we had ways to support folks who were just coming back from war to kind of, build a family and build a life. And before this time, you had to have about either 50% of the house down and then pay the rest off pretty quickly. And we didn't have the access and opportunities for mortgages to be spread over time. All that to say, what we didn't make clear, what we didn't articulate in our laws is we didn't say that these programs weren't offered to Black people, but because of racism, they weren't offered to Black people. And so when the suburbs were created and people started to move out, and it was actually almost cheaper to have a house in the suburbs than it was to have an apartment in the city, that wasn't available to Black families. It was only available to white families. So when we think about different suburbs around our cities, they were subsidized. We were subsidizing racism, basically. And so I teach about the psychology of racism, but I also teach about history because that's a part of understanding racism in our country. And students were livid. They were like, why didn't my school teach me this? Why am I just learning this?
Yeah.
Why didn't my parents tell me this? And some of them didn't believe me because, now there's a lot of rhetoric about college being like a bastion of liberal thinking. And I give all the citations, go off and read on your own. And when it would come to a colleague of mine, we teach similar courses. We would often joke, we have to tell our students when they go home for Thanksgiving to not get angry because their mind is blown. So all of that to say, I got tired of that. I thought, well, we send our kids to Kumon to learn their math or their, critical thinking and their reading. We send them to select basketball, baseball, soccer camps, and all over to, travel with their teams. And we are rigorous about all sorts of things with our kids. Why are we not rigorous about social issues? Why do we think that that they can't handle it? Well, raising equity is an answer to that for me, that we need to be having these conversations early and often, that we know that as young as less than a year, babies recognize race. They tend to look at people who are from their racial group the same amount of time more than they look at people from a different racial group. And there have been studies that have found the opposite. That's why I was pausing. Like there have been studies that have found that they tend more to people who are outside of their racial group because it's novel, right? All of that research just suggests that they see the difference, right? So we know that they see the difference. That doesn't mean that they are racist. That means they see color. They see skin color. They're learning about the world. Unfortunately, it only takes till about preschool, and they start to pick up the baggage that we have about race. So the racism, who's good, who's bad, who's smart, who's ugly, they start to pick that up as early as preschool. And for white kids, it can shape their friendship circle, who they end up being friends with. It doesn't as much for kids of color, but we know that as young as preschool and elementary age, they're making decisions based on these narratives and the system of racism. So if we don't have a conversation with them and talk to them about it, they're going to be lost to make their own sense of it. And oftentimes it's misinformation. And so that's why it's essential for all kids. Like for my kids, I have to talk to them about race and racism because they're Black boys in this world. And I would be doing them a disservice to not. My son, when he was 8 years old, was playing on a baseball league, and we went to play a game. It was one of the Catholic leagues in the area, and one of the teams was from the county. We were out in the county, and there were a few other brown boys on his team. Some brown boys, a couple Black boys. This team had all white boys, no kids of color. And when it came time at the end of the game to high five, the kids on the other team did not high five the Black and brown boys on our team. Now, these kids are 8, right? And so this is where I say, like, as white parents, I don't need you to just listen. I need you to talk to your kids, right? Like, so I know many of those parents, if we had at that moment paused everything, gone to talk to the parents and said, did you know your kids did this? I would imagine maybe some of them would have been fine with it and would have said, yeah, that's what we do at our house. But I think most of them would have been appalled. Don't you think?
Yeah. Okay. So then I have a couple of questions, and I know you can't answer this because this is my own. Why are white people so scared to talk about these things? So I'm going to be completely honest here. And this is what this is about. I don't feel I'm the only white mother who has had these thoughts. So I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, both girls. And when you started talking about how as early as 1, that they don't obviously recognize race and racism, they recognize color.
Right.
So I don't want to sit here and try to tell you that I feel like I love people of all colors and shapes and sizes. I feel like I do, but I have a lot of education still to help with this. But we went to the store and she got to pick out a Barbie.
Mhm.
She picked out a black Barbie,
Mhm.
and there I had no problem with it. I know that there are white moms that would have a problem with it. No big
Mhm.
deal. Okay, she picks out the black Barbie. We go and check out. There's a little black girl, and my daughter said, "Oh, hey mom, she's black." And I I was uncomfortable. I didn't know what to say because I didn't know if it was offensive to the little black girl and her mom. I didn't I'm like, how would my and then I was like, why?
And so her noticing that is great. That means she's learning her colors, she's learning about the world. I would have said, "Yes, her skin is brown. She has more melanin in her skin than you do, and it's beautiful, just like the Barbie you picked out."
But I don't understand why I am in tears right now and
Yeah.
why it hurt me because I was so proud of her, but I was scared because I didn't want the other family to be like, "Why is she saying I'm black?" And I mean, these are innocent
Because
kids.
she is, right? Like I think white people and I think I don't know, you can tell me, but I think sometimes the tears might be about, like you said, you feared that the mom might think you're racist,
Yeah. Yes.
right? And
Yes.
that's like the worst for someone who values are anti-racist. You feel like that's the worst thing anyone could call you.
Yes. 100%, which is what I wrote down. Why am I so nervous and scared?
I think we've set ourselves up, and this is the bind that we have to get out of, right? Like, I need you to continue to have the conversation. So it's not that I'm glad you're crying, but I'm glad you're emoting. I'm glad
Yeah.
you're being honest with yourself. It's scary, and we've got to do it.
So, as a teachable moment in the
Mhm.
future and for someone else listening, a white mother, if we're in that situation again, which we will be, and she says, "Oh, she's black," I just do what you say and say, "Yeah, and she's a beautiful girl just like you. She just has."
I would say, yeah, so I would acknowledge it. I would say, yes, she is. She has more and so I would explain it probably just, let me make it simple. I would say, yes, she is. Isn't she beautiful? That's a simple way to say it, right? Because then you're basically acknowledging, yes, she is black and she's beautiful. In that moment, because your daughter had just picked out that doll, I might have said, yes, she is. Isn't her skin beautiful, just like the doll you picked out? And keep it moving.
Okay. And
In
not worry about the mom or the daughter?
Well, but see, that's the thing. They know they're black. So I think your worry is what they will think about you.
Yeah.
And I think that they would think more of you if you were able to acknowledge that they are. Because, right, we're not trying to be colorblind. You just don't want people to judge you by your color. I want you to see that I'm black. We see that, right? So
Yeah.
colorblind is not the answer here. So you're acknowledging that, and then you're affirming the beauty of it, which in our society, there's a lack of. So if I were a black mom with my kid and some kid said, "Mommy, they're black," I would have more respect for them if they were like, "Yes." And, in that moment, I actually might do a little education. I might say something like, "Yes, their skin is brown because they have more melanin in their skin. We don't have as much melanin in our skin, but isn't their brown skin beautiful?" I mean, I would do something simple like that. That's a little lesson on melanin. It's naming, like, those people, that daughter and that mom, they know they're black.
And I feel like it's ignorant of me that I have just turned this into a white person's issue, but I think that that's part of the problem, Dr. Banks. I think that there are so many people like me who aren't talking and who they don't know what to say. And that's how I want to break down that barrier.
The only person that can break it down is you, right?
Yeah.
So
Well,
you gotta just do it. And so here's an example I often give. It's like lifting weights. It's like building the muscle to be able to do it. We can't hope to have muscle, right? Like, you've got to go work at it. You've got to lift the weight. And even if you lift the weight once, you're like, "Woohoo, I did that." You're still not strong. You have to do
no.
it over and over and over again. And I don't mean it in like a painful way. But if you've ever done weightlifting, like there's some gratification, like I'm getting stronger. I'm
Yep.
feeling like I can, lift more things around the house. It's not even about being bodybuilder strong. Like I'm functionally fit. This is good. This is important. And it becomes something that you want to do. You want to work that muscle because you want that strength. It's uncomfortable at first.
It's totally uncomfortable, but we have to be uncomfortable right now. That's the world we're living in, is uncomfortable, and it's up to us to change. I want to ask a question. I think that this was another thing that I think white people are confused about, and I don't know if this is a big deal or not, but I wrote it down. Like, am I supposed to say African American, or am I supposed to say Black? It's a
Good.
genuine concern of mine.
Yeah, so here's the thing, terminology changes. That there was a time when Afro-American was really popular. There was a time where Black was more like nowadays it's how people want to be identified. So if you said African American and someone referred to themselves as Black, then you follow their suit and use Black. Some people
Okay.
want to be called Latinx or Latino or Latina. Some people want to be called Hispanic. Some people want to be called by their nation of origin, Guatemalan, right? So we can't know everything, and
Okay.
terminology is ever changing. And so just go with the best that you know and be humble when you're corrected or ask.
Okay. So, I know I only have a few minutes left with you.
Oh, you're
I need
fine.
to I need to know what I can do, what my friends can do, what we need to do just to understand and to get more comfortable.
You need to start the conversation with each other. You need to do your homework. So I often point people towards We Stories. We Stories, WE stories, but a play on we small, right?
Mhm.
They're an
Yeah.
organization that's here, it started in St. Louis, but they actually they're having their first national cohort. But it's all about talking to kids about difference through books. So you can start talking to your kids through literature. You can start talking to each other. And then if you have relationships or proximity or connections to other folks, people who are people of the global majority, Black folks, people of color, then start watering those relationships, cultivating those relationships. But it can start before you have those relationships. It can really be learning alongside with your kid if there's gaps in your own knowledge.
I 100% believe, like, when you were talking about how your students were like, "Why weren't we taught this when we were in school?" I mean, that's how I feel. Like, why didn't I know about this and that and this and that? And one of the main takeaways I got from you too in this conversation, it's about the laws. It's just not something that it really hit me like, "Oh my gosh, these laws are what has divided a lot of things and people and communities."
Absolutely. And so you can extrapolate that. So in our system, like the way our society is, there are laws. In our homes and in our institutions, there are policies or practices or norms. And so we need to be on the lookout for what practices and norms and policies and laws perpetuate racism. There's a whole lot. There's a whole lot. And so that's the work that we need to do. I have a acronym with Raising Equity. We talk about raising equity nerds because we're real proud to raise nerds in other areas, right? And so raising equity nerds means that we name it. What is the system that's operating? So with what's happening now, it's police brutality. Let's name it. There's racism there, right?
Mhm.
That's the system. Then we educate ourselves. Okay, let's learn what's the history of this. It's on all of our radar because there's a tsunami of racial incidents happening right now. And George Floyd was brutally murdered. But what's the history? And so to understand the history of policing is actually very much tied to racism. So policing that started as an organized thing, even during the enslavement of Black people, to make sure slaves stayed and did not, run off, or people, chasing after fugitives. We also see race intersecting with law enforcement during Jim Crow era of the United States. So when there was a number of people being lynched, Black people being lynched, there were some cities and towns where the KKK was synonymous with law enforcement. And that's part of the history of law enforcement. So it's important to educate ourselves that the system in and of itself has been a tool of racism historically. And then we have to reframe it. So as we educate ourselves, we're able to reframe it. So it's not just George Floyd, a single incident. We reframe it as a systems problem, as a systemic problem. Oh, there's a pattern here. We can say their names. We can say his name, her name, Philandro Castile, Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland. We can say so many names. So that means we need to reframe this not as a single incident, but as a systems problem. So after reframe, we then start to dream up solutions. Okay, now that we can see that it's not just individual, it's systems problem. How could we create a system that doesn't have this inequity baked in? What would it look like? What would it look like to create a system of policing that's not racist? And then once we dream up solutions, we can then start to act. What's the next smallest possible step that we can take towards that dream of an equitable system that we've created? And so that NERDS framework is a way. You can't move through it all at once, right? But it's a way for you to think about how you can talk to your kids about isms, and in this case, racism, because oftentimes with our kids, we don't even, it's like we don't think that they can handle us even handling it.
Right. Oh, and they're like sponges. They soak everything up. I mean, it's just even like I said, with the 3-year-old, I don't think she fully understands the coronavirus, but she understands there's a virus and it's keeping her from going to school and it's keeping her from doing certain things. And so we talk about it. I mean, I have to have these tough conversations with her, and I am scared, but I need to. I have to, like you said not too long ago, it starts in the home.
It absolutely starts in the home. And so I'll go back to that story I was telling about my 8-year-old. So when we got to the car, I asked him how he felt because he noticed it. And just imagine if that was the first time that I had talked to him about race or racism. You can't explain all of that to an 8-year-old who's just sad that somebody didn't want to high five him, right? But I could remind him that we had talked about how some people believe lies about who Black people are, right? So that's not about you. That's about that other person being uneducated and believing lies and believing stories that are negative about Black people. So if I hadn't taught him about racism, I could say that that's just those are mean kids that didn't high five you. But I was able to put that into context. So the hope is he won't internalize that as being about him. He will understand and internalize that person is ignorant.
I mean, how could... Sorry.
No need to apologize.
How could you just not be so mad at white people? Thank God for people like you who take the time and talk to people like me and educate your kids to be better. God, that's awful.
It is awful. And, there are times where I don't feel so generous, but I don't hate all white people because of racism, right? Like, just like I don't hate all men because sexism exists.
I know.
Right? Like, we have to get more skilled at, and I think that is something that's tripped us up as a society, that we've seen racism as like this evil ill that's inside people's hearts.
Yes.
In reality, it's a system that we've set up. And there are some people who are evil in their hearts.
Yeah.
But, it's propped up like a system, like a moving walkway in an airport. It's going to keep going in that direction. It was built that way. Those Supreme Court judges who said only someone who's white can be a citizen, like those were all white men. And so they set up those laws. And so it's our responsibility to understand how the system has been set up, the way that the laws and the rules and the norms have been set up, and then to decide to restructure them. But it's not just about hearts and minds. We could be nice to each other all day long, sing Kumbaya, hold hands, and the system of racism would still be operating. We've got to see it as more than just hearts and minds. But I do believe there's a place for hearts and minds to change, because that sometimes fuels people to run for office and change something, or to be the head of their PTO and make sure that the curriculum tells full stories, act in their sphere of influence for change. So it's a both and. But I think we are more versed at seeing it as only individual. I think partly because we want to see that it's bad apples and we don't want to see that the barrel's rotten. And in reality, the barrel's rotten.
Yeah. So what's next for you, Dr. Banks? What are you going to go change next in the world? Because you're making a difference.
Oh, well, thanks. What I'm doing right now, I'm continuing with my research. So I try to understand from a psychological perspective, how can we support people who are experiencing discrimination? On my Raising Equity page on Facebook, my Dr. Kira Banks page, and my Raising Equity page, I try to provide education for folks around how they can start these conversations with their kids. So yeah, people can follow me at Dr. Kira Banks on Instagram, on Facebook. I'm Kira Banks on Twitter. And we try to model what those conversations might look like. We try to provide a perspective for someone who's starting to see systems and not just individual acts. And I'm hoping, like I said, I think it's a long game, that we can build a community of people who want to understand systems to interrupt them and are willing to create new practices, create new norms, so that we can have a more equitable society.
Well, I watched, some of the videos that you had, and already, have some great ideas besides this conversation, but other great ideas to implement in my household and spread to my friends and family. If you missed any of the information as far as where you can follow Dr. Banks, I will have it on the show notes at JillDevine.com. And I want to thank you. I know that sometimes the conversations are not easy, because sometimes people are not so open-minded, but I feel like safe. I felt safe talking to you about these things over the last 38 minutes or so. And I think that is a big factor in all this too. If you have to be open, you have to be uncomfortable. I am just feeling like I need to be a stronger, more confident woman and a stronger, more confident mom. And that's just part of what I can do.
Yeah, I think that we all have our work to do. And so find your lane and find your community, and join the Raising Equity community. Like I said, on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, because that's what I'm hoping to cultivate. Folks who have the desire to have new practices, but maybe don't have all the ideas. And so then we can share and we can learn from each other. So I'm glad you felt comfortable enough being honest with me and with your listeners.
Well, thank you so much. And I will continue to follow what you're doing, and maybe we can talk again soon. Give it a little bit and find out what's been happening and what's been changing in the world. But thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining me for today's episode. Make sure you subscribe, rate, and if you're feeling really generous, write me a review. And don't forget to join me next week for a new episode of Two Kids and a Career.